and we'll give a little bit of a housekeeping to begin with. So one of the things that we want to know right out of the gate is, what is your relationship currently to the RFP process? Are you here to learn more about it in general? Are you about to go through an RFP process? Are you in the middle of one? If you could go ahead and write into chat your name and sort of where you fall within those parameters, we'd really appreciate that. And that'll give us a little bit of an indication of where this conversation should lie from a point of, how the audience is engaged with the RFP process in general. I already see a couple people added some things to the QA. Maybe that's because chat isn't working. I know that happens occasionally. So yeah, let's just use QA. Good, smart move. As we do this, go ahead and in the future, if you get more questions, you can either use this tool to do that, or we'll also encourage folks to raise their hands, and at appropriate times, we'll unmute you so that you can ask your question live. I think that's going to be an easy way to kind of have that interaction in the meantime. So without further ado, we're here to learn more about the RFP process in general. And we've got two fantastic panelists with us. We've got Beth Power from Altai Systems and Tammy Marko from Achurch Consulting. And I am going to let them do their own introductions and tell you a little bit more about their experience with this process. So I'll turn it over to Tammy first.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. So hi there, I'm Tammy Marko. I work with Achurch Consulting. I've been in the association space for about 15 years. I started my career off doing technology consulting for federal government and intelligence community, but have been in the association space, like I said, for about 15 years. I've been an IT director at two different associations. And most recently, obviously, I'm with Achurch Consulting, doing a variety of things, helping clients go through system selections and implementations. And that's why I'm excited to be part of this webinar today, is to hopefully share some of my experiences with you.
And I am Beth Power. I am the Director of Customer Success here at Altai. I've been in the association space over 20 years, but for the majority of it, I was at the American Bar Association, so I was on the client side. I started in membership and marketing and then went to IT. And so I've been with Altai about 1.5 years, and it's been really educational to learn from the other side what it's like to receive the RFP to fill out, as opposed to being the one that is sending it out to vendors. And so I think this will be a great conversation, because I think both Tammy and I have a lot of different perspectives on it.
Yeah, thank you both. So go ahead and flip here to the next slide. This is today's agenda as a high-level overview. I think it's really important that we start with sort of this: do you even need an RFP? What is it for? What do we think about that process in general? And then we'll sort of roll through some more detailed things about the RFP process specifically. One in general, I think Tammy will have a really good opinion on, is should you use a consultant? And then on to gathering requirements and feature assessments, etc. You can see on the screen the rest of the agenda, but this is going to be a bit of a roundtable between our panelists, and we want to make sure that there's involvement from you in the audience. So please, again, don't hesitate to ask questions, raise your hand. But this is really meant to be able to get as much information from our panelists as possible, because they're experts in this field, and I think they've got a lot of really great things to say. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start on our first part of this conversation and hand it over to Beth.
Yeah, when I first came to Altai, I didn't realize not everyone does an RFP. So the American Bar Association had a policy that we had to do it, because we were focused on getting that competitive bid pricing. And so it was never really an option as to whether or not we do an RFP. But I've come to know and understand that what I think is important in an RFP is it gives clients it gives associations an opportunity to really do a good feature assessment list to make sure that will inform the selection process. If that's in the form of an RFP, great. If it's not, I think you still need that. And so I don't necessarily feel like you have to have an RFP in the traditional term of it, but you definitely, I think, have to have what are your basic guardrails of what you're looking for to help make that decision. That feature assessment feels like the most important thing. Certainly making sure you are in the ballpark for pricing and things like that, and if you have a policy. But it's, to me, the RFP is all about making sure you know going into it, generally speaking, what broad features you're looking for. Tammy, do you think do you?
Yep, absolutely. I totally agree with that. Having an understanding of what your pain points are, what's not going right for you currently, and so that you can evaluate how a new AMS could support you in that and help mitigate some of those issues that you're having. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that some organizations use this RFP process to help them understand what a budget range should be for a system. Because in many cases, organizations haven't been through this process in such a long time. They've been on the same AMS for 10, 15 years, that they really don't have a scope of what a budget might look like. So a lot of times I see organizations going through this process to even help them identify what anticipated costs might look like upon implementation.
That's true. When, I know that my last AMS implementation, everyone swore this is going to be the last one we ever do. And inevitably another one comes along, but it is a pretty big gap, or can be a pretty big gap, because it's a big investment. And so it may not be the same people who remember it. Pricing changes because technology changes. So that's a really good point.
Have either of you ever seen somebody try to go into a selection process and they not use an RFP process? And what would you what was your experience with that? Did it go well? Did it go poorly? How did that come about?
So I'll take that one to start, and Beth, you can add on. So from a consultant's perspective, we always encourage the RFP process because, like Beth said earlier, it really does give the organization the opportunity to understand what their needs are. And so there has not been a scenario specifically with an AMS where we would not recommend an RFP. We would always recommend an RFP. Beth, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I was involved in one where an RFP wasn't done and a feature list wasn't really done in a traditional sense. It was given in sort of a atypical fashion. And so during discovery, a lot of things came out that were significantly different than sort of what was understood in the non-traditional feature assessment. And so it wasn't that I think that there was, I don't believe that the failure was that they didn't do an RFP. I do think that would have forced them to do a feature assessment, which would have, I think, helped the miscommunication in, oh, this is what you really meant during the sales process, because it was very vague or super high level. And the devil is in the details sometimes. And in that case, the details really were meaningful that we didn't quite have that going into it. And I think that's why I sort of lean so heavily on that feature assessment part.
I'm just going to add one last caveat, which is, depending on how detailed the RFP is and how detailed you are in terms of getting what your high level needs and what your requirements are, that RFP can be leveraged during the discovery phase of your implementation because a lot of the legwork has already been done, at least from a high level perspective. So it can, in some ways, reduce the amount of time when it comes to discovery, depending on how detailed your RFP in fact is.
Yeah, I tell Chris that, I've told Chris that a lot, where like, let's never ask a question we don't know the answer, or if we know never ask a question that we can easily get the answer to in documentation that's already been sent from the client. And so that doesn't mean, I do have one caveat on that. I have seen things come in an RFP that then during discovery, it's like, oh, we don't really need that. And so it doesn't shortcut the need for discovery. It doesn't eliminate the need for discovery. It shortcuts the conversations, because then you can say, all right, let's just validate these line item requirements, and then which ones do we need to do a little bit deeper dive, or oh, it turns out this one is already outdated, or oh, now that you've seen this other feature, you're going to change a business process, and so but it definitely shortcuts that conversation for sure.
We've had somebody ask actually a fairly important level set question in the chat here. That is, how do you define feature assessment? Could you maybe go a little bit deeper into that so that we kind of all be on the same page?
Beth, do you want to take that one?
So what I view feature assessment or feature specs or assessment is, it can be anything from really general. Do you are you mobile responsive and some basic things like that, to do you allow multiple addresses, to do you do multi-currency, to how do you how do you run event registration? So it can be broad. How do you do events and things like that? And we're going to get into some question examples later. Or it can be fairly, if there's a pain point that you have that, like, hey, my system today doesn't allow multiple addresses, or it doesn't allow me to change an address type or something like that. Maybe that's super weedy, but that's been such a pain point. You really want to make sure that that's in there, because you're not lifting and shifting to recreate exactly what you do. You're trying to make it better. So I think that there's a degree of weeds that you want to get to without being closed off to what else you can sort of see. I see Tammy. I think that is
agree.
That good? Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. I think that this is probably a part of the topic that will continue throughout. I think it really covers a broad stroke of what this webinar includes, and will sort of be answered as we continue through the process. With that in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Tammy to sort of start us off on this conversation about what the role of the consultant is in this process.
Yeah, sure. So the role of a consultant can really address many different facets. A consultant tries to become an extension of staff, because staff are really focused on their day-to-day operations, and in most cases don't have enough time to really lead the charge of developing an RFP and guiding through this process. So we really focus on understanding your organization from a technology perspective, identifying where your challenges are, identifying what your needs are, getting those high-level requirements, and then we take the initiative to write the RFP itself, which is a time-consuming process, and can get down into the weeds. And so in some instances, so helping staff and helping an organization write that detailed RFP is an important aspect of a consultant as well. Another really key aspect that I find is narrowing down the list of providers that you're going to send that RFP to. Consultants have a wide breadth of experience with different AMS platforms, providers. And so in some cases, clients want to send the RFP out to 12 different providers. But the challenge is that it takes a lot of time for the vendor to respond to the RFP as well. And it takes a lot of time for your staff to review those RFP responses. Sometimes it can take 2 to 3 hours per response in order to really read it in detail. So by targeting your list of providers to send it to, I find very key. And so consultants can definitely help in that area. And the reason why is because we do understand who the players are in the market space and who the industry leaders are. And then obviously going through and managing the selection process itself. How do you down select the pool from, say, 6 vendors down to the 4 who are going to give you demos? And then how do you down select from those 4 to the 2 finalists who are going to show you, follow-up demos? We help manage that entire selection process. So I think there's a lot of different components to it that in order to support staff throughout that.
I do think that it does provide value to the vendor as well in that sort of narrowing your target list. We know that if it's coming from a vendor or from a consultant, then they've already sort of done a little bit of pre-vetting that we are at least in we're the right pool for consideration, and that we're, because responding, I thought writing an RFP was a time involved process until I got to the other side, and I'm like, oh, responding to an RFP, that's a lot too. And we want to make sure that RFP response is meaningful to the client, because it is a hard decision to make and it's a big budgetary decision. And so we want to be super thoughtful in our response. And so there is value in knowing that when it comes from a consultant, that there's some pre-vetting that's sort of already been done.
Yeah, another aspect that consultants can take the charge on is in terms of like writing a demo script. You never typically want to just get the generic demo from the vendor. You want it to be tailored to what your needs are for your organization, because the vast majority of AMS platforms in the market space can do most of the general things. They can handle membership and committee management and, some basic event management, but it's really those one-offs, those nuances associated with your own organization that you should really focus on for the demo to ensure that they can hit those topics. That they can do membership, but can they do this specific scenario that's unique to your organization? So consultants can also help crafting that demo script. And the other thing that I want to mention in regards to demos is we've all been through good demos and we've all been through bad demos. And it's not necessarily the product that was bad. Sometimes the person giving the demo may have had an off day, or maybe they're new and they didn't know how to articulate the features. So we try to coach our clients sometimes to see past the person in the presentation and really look to what the platform has to offer.
One of the things I'd say about the consultant role as an aside is there's a through line that they're able to see from the beginning of the process all the way to the end that many folks may not understand because they haven't been through the process in a while, or it's new to them, or some other aspect. So one of the things that we find with consultants is that ability to sort of see the end and start with that in mind as they begin the process. Do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
Beth, are you able to take the initial on that?
Well, maybe there's no follow-up.
I'm sorry, can you rephrase, Chris? I apologize. Can you just rephrase?
It really wasn't a question. It was just more of a, I think it's really important to sort of be able to see the entire process when you're crafting an RFP and understand.
Oh, absolutely.
To the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry about that. And so, a lot of times clients haven't been through the process in a long time, and there is a process to follow: the RFP process, the demoing process, the down selecting process. So yeah, being able to, leverage a consultant who knows what that process is and can help walk you through that is extremely important, I find.
We've got a really good point sort of here in the chat, and because we are an AMS company, we tend to focus on RFPs for that service. Do you have any thoughts, or Tammy, have you had any experience with RFPs that are other services?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's not just AMSs, RFP process for CMS, if you're getting a new website, for LMS, LMS providers. A lot of organizations are leveraging best of breed systems, event management systems. So yeah, you can leverage the RFP process in different areas where it makes sense. Some, not all, require an RFP. But for the larger platforms, it's definitely recommended to go forward with an RFP.
And just another point that was raised here in the QA is a dislike of RFP questions that are too broad and that can allow equally vague yes answers, or could be $4 to $4,000. So I think that's an excellent point to be raised, and how you craft that. And we'll probably get to that a little bit later as we talk specifically about questions.
Yeah, watch this space. That's coming up in a couple slides.
Tammy, I'm going to stick here with you on this one. Can you maybe give us your thoughts on feature assessment and requirements gathering. I think this was a question that sort of came up a little earlier, and I think it's important to sort of restate that and continue that conversation.
Yeah, sure. So, we discussed earlier of, talking with the entire organization to find out what your needs are, to identify what your requirements are. But from an RFP perspective, it really needs to be a higher level requirement gathering. It doesn't have to be, extremely nuanced, unless, like I mentioned, you may have these one-off characteristics that really you require for your specific organization. So it's important to know not only what the organization is looking for in a new system, but it's important to also consider what your customers have been asking for from their perspective, how it might pertain to a new AMS. And that really translates to what their online user experience is from a portal, from a shopping perspective. How do they register for an event? How do they join in membership, and what does that experience look like for them? So you really need to consider the full gamut when talking about requirements. The one thing that I'm going to caution, though, is this is not the time to solution. A lot of times it's hard for people to not go into solution mode and try to fix the problem. That is not what you're wanting to do in this process. You're wanting to articulate what the challenge is and what your need is instead of how to do it. So that's an important distinction when it comes to the requirements gathering.
You said something earlier about demos, and like sometimes somebody's having an off day, and sometimes, so don't be sort of swayed by the sort of, maybe you don't have a connection with the salesperson, but the salesperson's not who you're going to be sort of working with, and be open to sort of what the system might do. So don't sort of solution too early. As you were saying that, I thought about sort of, whenever you watch House Hunters and you get the person who's going to a house and they're like, oh, I don't like the color of this bathroom wall. And so then they like disregard the whole house because they don't like the color of the wall. So like you got to sort of make sure you as you're looking at it, build the RFP so that you're looking at the bones of the system and the structure of the system. And maybe you need to knock out a wall kind of thing. And so but don't knock that wall out until you sort of see that bones and that structure, because it might be something that you want to change your process a little bit different. I could totally take that analogy a little too far, so I'm going to stop there. But it's important. I agree. Don't solution too early.
Yeah. And I'm just going to address the second bullet that's on the slide in terms of being open to adjust your scope. Again, there are organizations that have been on the same platform for 15 years. And in some instances, their platform doesn't meet their needs or hasn't met their needs for a long time. And so they have gone out and secured these third-party systems to achieve what their AMS couldn't achieve for them. But in some of the modern AMS systems, the more modern, more enterprise level SaaS systems, some of those capabilities can be brought into the AMS, where it used to not be able to be capable in your current AMS, but in the newer AMSs, sometimes that functionality can be encompassed. And when you see those opportunities, explore them and see if they make sense for you, because there are benefits of having additional data points within a more centralized repository. So just keep that in mind as well.
I think that's a great point. And just to kind of pivot on that a little bit, we've got Tony in the chat that said they have also learned that there's a difference between out of the box and customizations, which can add costs. And I think that's a little bit around what you're referring to. And I'll add in there that, with a lot of the more modern, as Tammy put it, there's also configuration. And Beth, in a conversation a couple of weeks ago, brought up the fact that, what we do includes duplicate detection, but we need to be able to configure that specifically to how you want to detect duplicates. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can think about all the different things that are within a system, whether it's an AMS or an LMS or a community online tool or something along those lines.
Yeah, I had a meeting with a client recently who said, I keep hearing, yeah, yep, we can just configure that. And when they a business need, and he's like, that just that felt like a salesy, you can't possibly, that's clearly going to be a customization, that's clearly going to be more involved. And then we sort of prototyped something that he thought was going to be way more involved. And he's like, oh, like, these new platforms that he's not on today really does have a lot of configuration that doesn't take you off an upgrade path. That's not a costly customization. I mean, configuration takes staff time to do, but you're not doing hours and hours of development code. And so that's where bridging that gap between just flip a switch out of the box, and you want some configuration probably for a lot of what you do. But that's just, I do home and work and school, or I just want to do home and school. I mean, there's some basic setup things like that. So there's a bridge between out of the box, flip a switch, and customizations for sure.
So I'm just going to put in another point for why a consultant is beneficial, is because the vast majority of organizations say that they do configuration and not customization, and consultants can definitely give guidance in terms of where that's more accurate and where it might be less accurate. So a consultant can help in that area too.
I think that's an excellent point, because it's definitely I think a topic of the industry in general, whether it's an AMS or another tool, is those definitions matter, and how people use those terms matter. So that is a great sort of opportunity with your consultant is translator. Okay, I lost my place a little bit, but I think that we're on to more things to consider ahead of the RFP process. And I think that this was a conversation that we had, Tammy, where you had some very specific thoughts on. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, one of the things to consider ahead of the RFP is, who is going to be responsible for ultimately making the decision of the selected vendor. And you really do need to focus on a core team of individuals throughout your organization in order to make sure that they're part of the process. And so you definitely want to think about that ahead of time. Think about who, and typically it's maybe liaisons in each of the different functional areas of your organization, but lean on them in order throughout the entire process, not just the RFP development, not just the selection process, but even through implementation. That continuity is an important aspect. And it definitely helps even post implementation as well, to keep that continuity going. Make sure that people are aware, that the team is aware of changes that are taking place, so they can communicate that down the line to staff. Beth, do you have other input on that?
Yeah, to the point where, don't start solutioning too early. If there may be changes to your process, and going back to you're not lifting and shifting, you are changing systems because you want to improve your day-to-day life. You want to make something easier. You want to make something more automated. You want a better customer experience. And so that inevitably is going to involve some change in what you do. And so making sure communication throughout the process, and that people know things are going to change. People, need to be receptive. It's sort of managing that change. That's a significant part of it. It kind of goes to one of the other ones, sort of HR management. The role of a consultant, you mentioned this earlier, Tammy, people have their day-to-day jobs and sort of full-time jobs. And so a consultant can come in and help do that. Once you make that selection process, doesn't mean your day-to-day stuff goes away, but it doesn't mean you don't still have a lot to do for an implementation. There's lots of discovery meetings. There's lots of things to sign off and test and review. And so do you have the right people earmarked for that? And if you're switching systems that are a different sort of base tool, do you have your professional development teed up so that if there's some additional training that people can attend early on to, help be part of the conversation, or if there are, you need to hire someone new because you're going to start doing something completely different. So involving making sure staff are taken into consideration. It's a big change. And so, you want to manage that change management, but along with that, that's, getting new skill sets, or their job might change because you are, automating something and that frees them up to do more of the mission work or things like that. So it's making sure staff feel comfortable about all of that as well. And to what you said, Tammy, about sort of who your core team is, I know that, what makes associations unique is the sort of parallel reporting structure where you sort of report up to staff, and then there's usually membership oversight as well. And so I have been on selection committees that are 50 people because everyone needed to have a voice at the table. And so finding a way to ensure that you're managing your volunteers and your members to be part of the process, but also making sure it's not sort of the road, that becomes a roadblock.
Yeah, there's definitely a sweet spot in terms of how many people should participate in that selection process and who should be part of that selection team. Sometimes if you get too many cooks in the kitchen, it becomes analysis paralysis from narrowing down who the provider should be. I'm going to go back to one other thing that you mentioned, Beth, in terms of staff. I think it's important to also engage staff throughout the process, particularly the implementation process, not as much so during the selection process. And what I mean is in terms of them being able to gain adoption. Some staff are worried and concerned about a new AMS coming in, and their day-to-day tasks are going to change. The unknown is scary. And so involving them throughout that process and keeping them in the know, keeping them in the loop definitely helps alleviate that. And then from a change management perspective, it is a lot of change for staff, but it's also change for the customer and how they use your system and the tool itself. So, I always like to make a recommendation to consider marketing initiatives. Tee it up so that your customers know a change is coming. How does it impact them? Do they have to get a new user ID and password? What might it look like? It's also a great opportunity to have them update their profile. If you're missing key demographics, this is the prime time. Let them know a new AMS is coming. Let them know that they have the ability to update their demographics, which gives you better data.
Because it always comes back to, if you don't have good data, you can't better serve your customers. You can't, run your business without that data management. And so, and getting this shiny new system, and you don't want to sort of shift over a lot of incomplete or bad data. And so having your data, having a good data migration and a data cleanup plan early on, because that takes work and that can be tedious, and not waiting till the last minute to look at your data is important as well. Yeah. Chris, I saw a chat come through that you said you cleared up the chat issues. Were there any questions on this topic, or are we?
Roberta just posted, how do you deal with the different stakeholders that have different bosses? How far up and down the chain should the evaluation discovery team go? I think that's a fantastic question.
Yeah, so the way that we typically handle that is, like I mentioned before, having liaisons for each functional area. And so that liaison can be a roll-up of people from their department. So obviously it depends on how large or small your organization is, but it's really those liaisons that play the key role in being the voice for the staff and functions that are in their department, that are in that area. So it is important for those liaisons to be part of the entire process. It is not an IT project. This is not an IT selection. It is an organizational selection. And ultimately, the new AMS is supporting the foundation of almost every department in fact, every department in your organization. And so that's why it's so important to get an understanding from each of those leads, from each of those departments, what their needs are, how it's going to help them, and have them be part of the process so that they can ensure that what their requirements are for their for their department are in fact considered and implemented.
I have a question that may be actually a little bit difficult to answer, but intuitively, these liaisons that you speak of, this takes time out of their normal workflow. Do you have an indication of how much time they should be dedicating to being the liaison and handling this process?
It's hard to say like what a time estimate might be,
Yeah.
but again, it depends on how many providers you're looking at and exploring. And like I said, it can be 2 to 3 hours per RFP response to review. The demos themselves can be 3 hours each. And so, it really does depend on how many providers you're looking at, but that's a pretty decent ballpark, per RFP response and per demo, how long it takes.
And I would just add to the stakeholders, if you don't have support at the C level, it's going to make this process hard. So if your executive director, CEO, CFO aren't on board with understanding that this is going to be a significant change, it's going to be a significant budget endeavor, clearly this project doesn't sort of move forward and it doesn't work, and you need those key stakeholders. But without the liaisons, not just during the selection process, but being the ones that are going into the weeds once you start discovery, the ones who use it day to day, you would never want sort of a high level manager going in and saying, yep, these are all the details of how membership works, without somebody sort of on the front line saying, yeah, that might be what the policy is, but our procedure is we do this every single time because that doesn't really work that way. And so it becomes a balancing act. And so you can't forget either side of it, I think. And that makes it, that can make it a challenge, because then you start to get that group a little bit too big to be effective, but it's a risk worth taking, I think.
Beth, I think that you were on a bit of a roll there. I'm going to throw it back to you.
Yeah.
You sort of talking about this section. I think this is an area that you felt very passionately about. We talked about it a little bit already, but how important is it to sort of construct some of these questions or ways of thinking about the RFP?
Yeah, so I mean, we've touched on a lot of these, but when you ask someone, how do you do this, or ask for more specifics, that is meaningful. When you ask, do you have the ability to do this? That's when you sort of get well, yeah, we can configure everything. And sometimes people, that actually is a true statement, in the sense of like configuration does allow for a lot more flexibility than we're used to in sort of previous systems. But that may not help you with your selection process. And so asking how you do something, really limiting sort of the yes, no beyond the basics. So Tammy brought up earlier that, most systems out there are going to do all of the basics. And so, yeah, you want to maybe check the box. And so it's not that you don't ever do yes, no, checking the boxes is important as well. But when you ask too generic of a question, or if you just ask yes, no questions, you're not really getting to what distinguishes one vendor from another. Understanding, and this may not be in the functional specific question, but giving sort of the, it may come in the demo agenda, it may come through the RFP back and forth questions that you have with the different vendors who might do it. but why you need some specific functionality. It may be that you need multi-concurrency for this very specific reason that oh, we thought you meant this, but really it's this other thing that we can sort of solve. I don't think multi-currency is a good example of that, because that's probably just a yes, no, but you understand what I'm saying. But sometimes why you need it goes into, you shouldn't start solutioning, and you really don't want the vendor to start solutioning too much, but they might be able to demo, well, here's one way we would solve for this. And we'll get into the more details during the discovery, but here is, how one option of how you might solve for it. And so getting some specifics, that helps. To Tammy's point about the high level, you don't want to get in the weeds for too much, but the weeds are what distinguish you, client, from another client. So the weeds are what might distinguish you for something specific that is really unique to this association that another association might not do. And so those are the things that you want the vendor to be focusing on, so that you can make sure that you're making the best selection. And this last one is kind of my pet thing, I guess. Every association gets really has a million acronyms and calls their members maybe something a little bit different, or calls their chapters or sections or whatever. And I have definitely sat in RFPs or vendor demos on the client side, and they're like, oh, well, they don't handle sections, when really the vendor just called them that salesperson happened to call them chapters, and the association I worked for called them sections, and so they got a little lost in that sort of inside baseball because it was a different terminology. So acronyms, everyone knows what some acronym is, but that might not be the case, and so don't get too lost in worrying about terminology. It's what's underneath that.
And I'll throw that back to Tammy as another point in the column for why you need a consultant, is to translate those inside terms.
Yeah, we can definitely help translate. Yeah, definitely translate that. I'm going to go back to something that you mentioned, Beth, which was, in regards, sometimes it's hard to ask an appropriate question to get to what it is that you are looking for.
Right.
And so I have found that writing narrative around what you are trying to achieve, again, kind of keeping that high level, what is it that you're trying to get at? How do you do it today? And what are your roadblocks? To explain to the vendors, again, not in the common areas, not necessarily in membership or committee management, but if you have these nuanced areas, write the narrative in terms of, here's how your organization handles it, and here's where our pitfalls are right now. And then that gives the vendor enough context so that they can then respond to that particular need that you have, because sometimes it is hard to write a question that is understandable for the vendor. They may not get what it is that what you're trying to say or what your true need is without explaining it and articulating it.
Yeah, I have seen RFPs come through that had, here are our top 5 or top 10 business use cases. And so scenario 1, scenario 2. What I loved about that was, oh, we're going to be able to turn these into user stories. We're going to be able to turn these into test cases. This is actually a jumpstart on lots of things that come down the process, or down through the process. But it also just really frames the conversation for the demo and for the RFP response itself. And so I'm a big fan. Chris likes to say clarity is kindness. I like to say framing the conversation. I think both are really important. And so to your point, the narrative helps do both of those.
We did have another, chat pop up that it's an anonymous attendee that said, as a consultant, it'd be helpful to know the range of the budget for a project, or the pain point, something that can be too high. I've spent hours on proposals that may not have ever considered for a budget that's out of sync with the hours required and the rates, et cetera. I think that's a sort of important point to bring up, that's a really vital part of what the RFP does, is can sort of set the standard for what that budget should be and how to fit that within scope.
And I'm going to spin that a little bit differently, where a consultant already has a very good pulse on what a typical implementation cost is for these variety of vendors. And so, when you're targeting which vendors to submit your RFP to, you don't want to send it to someone that's gonna come in 5 times over what your budget is. That's just not a good use of time. And it just, it's just not a good target. And so a consultant can help narrow that gauge. If you do have a specific budget number in mind for an AMS implementation or year-over-year licensing costs, we can absolutely help put guardrails in terms of, which vendors could potentially fit in that category as well.
Excellent point. Yep. Okay. Beth, I'm gonna kick it over to you again. I think that this is a really big one as far as how do you compare once you get these RFP backs? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm actually going to kick it to Tammy because I think she's the one who's doing apples and oranges.
Yeah, that works. So once you get your RFP responses back, it can be really challenging to compare them against each other. Sometimes you're not always comparing apples to apples. Sometimes it feels like it's comparing apples to oranges in the way that they articulate how they can meet the needs. And even just from a costing perspective, we try to minimize the apples to oranges and we try to keep it more apples to apples in the RFP process by making a more structured, we ask a more structured response in hopes of being able to compare closer. But, some vendors, like you said, just check the box. Yes, we do it. Others write great narrative around, how they can help you achieve. Licensing costs can vary in terms of the terminology that they use. Is it an admin license or a full license or a standard license? And so it can be very challenging. The consultant can definitely help play the translator role in what those areas mean. And so the other aspect I wanted to mention is, when you are reviewing an RFP response at this stage, it's pretty still subjective, right? You're trying to gauge whether the vendor can in fact do what you're wanting them to do. And so it's okay that you don't know in great detail how they are going to do something. It's just making sure that you feel comfortable with the fact that they can achieve what you want, what you are wanting to achieve in your AMS implementation. So it can be challenging sometimes to review and compare those RFPs.
We got a question in the chat that said, what about soft services that are customizable and not cookie cutter? Is there a way to think about those?
I'm trying to think of a scenario. I'm not sure I have a scenario offhand.
Maybe if our comments raise their hand, we can allow them to elaborate.
I'm assuming it's the project management part of it and the documentation part of it and communication for statuses and that, sort of that project management that you're not going to see an end product for like coding, or you're not going to see like the end configuration, but you need good project management throughout the process. Did the person raise their hand, or should I assume that was the question? I'm going to assume that was the question. I think it's totally fair during the RFP process to ask for sample documentation. What does your project documentation look like? What is your project methodology? Understanding, like, are you going to send me a bunch of documents just to send me, are you documents, or, in which case, hey, that's a lot of hours you're going to burn just to do like, a status every day or status every week that of, I've already had 5 meetings with you this week, and you're going to add another status meeting that then recaps what I've already talked to you about 4 other times this week. And that's extra hours that end up being in your budget. And so what is your sort of philosophy around that? And in some cases that's important for us as vendors to tell you. And in some cases, we have a methodology. Sometimes that methodology can be fairly adapted to fit, to ensure that there is that good fit. So, how do you like to work in teams, or how do you like to sort of pass things? We'll have a methodology. It doesn't have to be written in stone, that it's not flexible in order to sort of have that fit. But it is totally appropriate and important, I think, to ask, hey, how do you manage these projects?
And the elaboration came back as talking about consultants, coaches, and the like of that. That's maybe not in a technology specific, but I think, Beth, what you just stated probably falls in line with that a bit. But Tammy, if you've got further thoughts, since as a consultant, you probably have to also answer RFPs on services.
Yeah, my only, I'm not sure if this is getting at the specific question, but making sure that you do get multiple bids for whatever the service is that you're looking for, so that you can compare them against each other to make sure that the pricing is aligned, that the offering is aligned. So I was just going to add that as a caveat.
What comes next? Tammy, I'm going to hand this one back over to you. So you kind of
Yeah, sure. So what comes next? So after the RFP process, and you've compared, you've written the great RFP and the responses have come back, and you've whittled it down, to the organizations and the products that you think may best fit your needs. Next is the demo phase, where you're getting more granular in terms of how particular products are able to support you. And, there's such a wide range in terms of, what strikes well with people. Is it the visual? Do you need reporting? Can you do self-service? Are you non-technical and you don't want to do self-service reporting? So are there canned reports? So, going through the demo process is obviously a huge component of the AMS selection. Using scorecards, we find pretty beneficial throughout the entire process, because it gives, more of a data-driven approach to it. It's not the end-all be-all. It's not whoever ranks, a platform the highest, that's the one. No, it's not like that. But it is used as one of the factors in terms of down selecting your vendors. So a scorecard we find very important as well. It's important, like I mentioned earlier, to have the continuity of that AMS selection team to be part of these, and all of these different processes here. It ensures that the requirements for their departments will be met. It ensures that they have a voice if there's an issue or concern that's bubbling up from their line within the organization. And it builds, it gains momentum and traction and adoption for future on during the implementation. So, typically after you see all of the demos, that's when you start teeing up what the contracting phase might look like with your selected provider. And then obviously, identifying what the timeline might look like to begin implementation. And you'll need to consider a wide variety of things: holidays, blackout dates. Do you have an audit coming up and it's not a good idea to start at that time? So, do you have a big event that all the staff are going to be focused on? You definitely want to keep those things into consideration throughout this process, because you don't want it to be frustrating for them to, have to try to juggle, an event that they're trying to manage, and then also the AMS selection or seeing the demo. So definitely keep people's schedules in mind when looking at that. But that's ultimately what comes next, are the demos, doing the scorecards, down selecting to who your 2 finalists are, and then having a thorough discussion around which platform is ultimately going to suit the needs of the entire organization.
And we've taken a fairly strong sort of software view on this because that's where a lot of us are. But I would imagine you could probably say the same for the services we've been asked about in previously. So maybe you would replace demos with, follow-up meetings and questions and that process.
Sure.
Still aligns, don't you think?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And the other thing I wanted to mention is be open to which product, service, provider that you're going to go with. Some people come in with these preconceived notions that they do not want X, X product. So they don't even want to consider them. But what I say to you, if you all are in that situation where you have teams or staff that are, you have a preconceived notion of, a particular platform, is be open-minded, because the platforms have so much variation and function in them. The consultant can definitely help guide you in terms of opening, I'm just going to say opening and broadening those blinders potentially to have you see that, maybe one that you aren't interested in might really be the right fit for you. And that definitely happened with a client that I had. They came in and said, we do not want X. And ultimately they ended up selecting X. It was really the best one for them. So just be open to that as well.
It raises a really interesting question in my mind, and something that we've run into a couple times is an association divided, where one portion of the association really prefers X even after the demo, and the other prefers Y. And then there needs to be a bit of a consolidation between the two factions and determine sort of what is best for the organization at large. Do you have any experience with that you can talk about?
So personally, I don't have experience where they have been a divided house. Normally when you have when you have these liaisons across the organization, they're typically at a higher level in the organization, so they can understand that they need to do what's best, not just for them, but what's best for the organization. And so it is an evolution, that's for sure, but I have never really experienced it where it has been truly divided. But everyone does get their input in through these scorecards and through voicing it through their liaisons to hopefully come to a good consensus that everybody can live with.
And I think that's why those key C-suite stakeholders are important, to have that holistic view. If there are people who are really just championing one system over another because it meets their very specific needs, having the C-suite part of the conversation, I think, is really important, and important to prevent a sort of analysis paralysis if you sort of spend too much time neither side sort of giving in and sort of digging in on which product. I would assume that if it is fairly divided like that, that means both products will meet their needs, and it's just a matter of personal preference and, hey, let's make a decision and move forward. Otherwise we're, not benefiting either side.
One of the, sort of as an aside from that conversation, Lucas posted in the chat asking if there was a centralized place to post RFPs where many vendors can see them. I'm not aware of one, but I don't know if that's something that anybody else has come across. You can share in the chat if you're familiar as an attendee, maybe.
I am not aware of one.
No. Great idea.
Yep.
I think that we hit our mark there, Chris, at the hour mark.
Yep, I think we're right there, and we've been asking really good questions as we've gone along. So I think, thank you everybody for your attention and your participation, and the questions were fantastic, and apologies again for not having the chat functioning at the beginning. And I know somebody else asked about closed captioning, and we'll definitely have that on the recording for anybody that needs it. And we'll send that recording out probably early next week, so that if you were only here for part of the time, you'll be able to sort of review what you missed.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. We appreciate it.